I was 34 years old when my own father looked straight at the judge and said, "Your Honor, my son has been a failure since the day he was born." Those words should have crushed me, but by then I had heard them so many times that they no longer sounded like an insult. They sounded like background noise, like the ticking of an old clock that had hung in the same hallway for decades. The courtroom became so quiet that I could hear someone turning the pages of a legal pad somewhere behind me. My mother sat beside my father with her hands folded neatly in her lap, wearing the same gentle smile she had shown our neighbors for years, the smile everyone admired because it made her seem kind, patient, and loving. If you had walked into that courtroom without knowing us, you would have believed every word they were about to say. They had spent my entire life building a story, and according to that story, I was the ungrateful son who never appreciated his parents, the irresponsible man who wasted every opportunity, the disappointment who blamed everyone else for his own mistakes. Even I had believed parts of that story once. My attorney quietly rested a hand on the table without saying a word. He had warned me before we entered the courtroom that my parents would probably attack my character instead of focusing on the facts. "Stay calm," he had told me. "Truth doesn't need to raise its voice." I kept staring ahead, refusing to look at either of my parents. The polished wooden walls reflected the afternoon sunlight that poured through the high windows, giving the room a warm glow that somehow made the atmosphere feel even colder. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the documents spread across her bench. Judge Eleanor Hayes had a reputation throughout the county for being patient but impossible to mislead. She listened more than she spoke, and when she finally asked a question, people usually wished they had been more honest from the beginning. I had heard that from nearly everyone who had ever appeared in her courtroom. I silently hoped it was true. My father stood with complete confidence. At 67, Richard Brooks still carried himself like the successful businessman everyone respected. His gray suit was perfectly tailored, his tie centered exactly where it belonged, and his voice carried the calm authority that had impressed clients for decades. He knew how to command a room. My mother, Susan Brooks, nodded gently whenever he spoke, adding small expressions of disappointment that looked completely natural. Together, they were convincing. They had practiced this performance for years. The attorney representing my parents cleared his throat before speaking. "Your Honor, this case is simple. Our clients spent decades sacrificing everything for their son. Instead of gratitude, they received neglect, financial loss, and emotional distress." I almost smiled at how familiar those words sounded. Sacrifice, gratitude, failure. Those three words had followed me since childhood. Whenever I brought home an A instead of an A+, my father reminded me how much they had sacrificed. Whenever my older brother received another award, my mother would quietly ask why I couldn't be more like him. When I earned my first promotion at work, they barely acknowledged it because someone else's son had become a doctor. Every achievement somehow became evidence that I still wasn't enough. After years of hearing the same message, you stop arguing. You start wondering whether everyone else sees the same version of you. I had spent most of my adult life trying to prove that I wasn't the disappointment they described, but no amount of effort ever changed the story they wanted to tell. The judge finally looked up from the paperwork. Her expression revealed nothing. "Mr. Brooks," she said, addressing my father, "you've made several serious claims regarding your son's conduct. Every one of them is true," my father answered immediately. "I've spent years trying to help him become a responsible man." My mother sighed softly as though remembering countless sleepless nights. It was a small performance, almost invisible, yet remarkably effective. I heard someone seated behind me whisper, "Those poor parents." For a brief moment, I closed my eyes. If this had happened 10 years earlier, I might have stood up and defended myself. I might have listed every overtime shift I worked, every birthday I spent alone because I was chasing another promotion, every holiday I skipped because I was trying to build a future my parents could finally respect. But experience had taught me something painful. People rarely change their minds because you speak louder. They change their minds when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. Judge Hayes slowly turned another page, then another. Her eyes paused on something buried deep inside the stack of documents. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she reached for a separate folder resting beside her bench, one that neither attorney had mentioned since the hearing began. She opened it carefully, studying the first page much longer than anything she had reviewed before. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. My father's confidence remained unchanged. My mother still wore her practiced expression of quiet heartbreak. Neither of them noticed the subtle change in the judge's face. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't anger. It was recognition, the look of someone who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle. Judge Hayes lifted her eyes from the folder and looked directly at my parents. "Before we continue," she said calmly, "there is one matter this court must address." My attorney slowly sat up straighter. My heartbeat became louder than the silence surrounding me. Whatever was inside that folder had not been part of the arguments we expected to hear today. And for the first time since the hearing began, I saw something I had never imagined seeing on my father's face. It lasted less than a second, almost too quickly to notice, but it was there. Uncertainty. I sat perfectly still while Judge Hayes continued reading the document, but my mind drifted years into the past, long before lawyers, courtrooms, and legal files entered my life. It drifted back to a small two-story house outside Columbus, Ohio, where every morning began with the same unspoken competition. My older brother Daniel always seemed to know exactly what to say and exactly how to make our parents proud. He was captain of the baseball team, earned straight A grades, and could carry on conversations with adults as though he had been born knowing all the right answers. Family friends would smile and say, "Richard and Susan must be so proud." Then someone would turn toward me with polite curiosity and ask what I was interested in. Before I could answer, my father usually did it for me. "Ethan is still trying to figure himself out." Everyone laughed softly, and I laughed too because I thought that was what I was supposed to do. Looking back now, I realized those moments taught me something dangerous. They taught me that I was expected to be less. As I grew older, the comparisons only became sharper. If I earned a 95 on a math test, my father would ask why it was not 100. If I spent an entire weekend helping him repair the fence around our property, he would thank Daniel for mowing the lawn because it showed responsibility. I kept telling myself that one day I would finally do something impressive enough to earn the same smile my brother received so effortlessly. Instead, the finish line kept moving farther away. My mother rarely raised her voice. That almost made her disappointment harder to bear. She had a gentle way of saying things that sounded loving until you thought about them later. She would straighten my shirt before church and whisper, "Please do not embarrass your father today." If I forgot to return a library book on time, she would sigh and say, "I worry that you are not dependable enough for the real world." Every sentence sounded like concern, but every sentence quietly reinforced the same idea. Something was wrong with me. By the time I entered high school, I had become an expert at apologizing for things that were not really mistakes. I apologized for asking questions, for making suggestions, for needing help, and even for succeeding whenever my success happened to attract attention away from my brother. During my senior year, I won first place in a statewide engineering competition with a bridge design project that had taken months to complete. My teacher shook my hand and told me I had a remarkable future. I rushed home carrying the trophy, convinced that this would finally be the moment everything changed. My father barely looked up from the newspaper. "That is nice," he said. "Did Daniel tell you he has been accepted into one of the best business schools in the state?" My trophy stayed on the kitchen counter for 3 days before I quietly carried it upstairs to my bedroom. No one ever asked where it went. After graduation, I received a partial scholarship to a respected university. It was not enough to cover everything, but I was determined to make it work. I worked evenings at a grocery store stocking shelves until midnight, attended morning classes, and spent weekends tutoring high school students to pay for textbooks. I rarely slept more than 5 hours each night, but every paycheck felt like proof that I could build a life on my own. Whenever my parents called, however, the conversations always ended the same way. "If you had planned better, you would not be struggling. Daniel never has these problems. You always make life harder than it needs to be." I stopped telling them about the long nights or the grades I was earning because none of it seemed to matter. During my junior year, I was offered a paid internship with a manufacturing company that specialized in industrial equipment. My supervisor praised my work ethic and hinted that a full-time position would likely follow after graduation. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I could finally stand on equal footing with everyone else. I called my parents that evening, hoping they might be excited. My father listened in silence before saying, "Do not celebrate too early. Plenty of people start well and end up failing." Those words stayed with me far longer than I wanted to admit. Even after I graduated and accepted the full-time job, I found myself questioning every decision, afraid that one mistake would prove my father right. My coworkers described me as careful, dependable, and hardworking. Yet every compliment felt temporary, because the voice I heard most clearly was still the one from home reminding me that I would never quite measure up. Years passed, promotions came, and I slowly built a stable career, but I never escaped the need to seek my parents' approval. Every holiday I arrived with thoughtful gifts, every birthday I remembered, every family gathering I attended, even when I was exhausted from work. Somehow I always left feeling smaller than when I arrived. If I bought a modest townhouse after years of saving, my parents asked why I had not purchased something larger. If I received another promotion, they wondered why I had not become an executive already. Nothing was ever openly cruel. Nothing was dramatic enough for outsiders to notice. It was simply a lifetime of tiny reminders that I would never be enough in their eyes. Sitting in that courtroom years later, listening to my parents describe me as though I had spent my entire life disappointing them, I realized something painful. They were not inventing a new story for the judge. They were repeating the same story they had told me since I was a little boy. The only difference was that this time someone else was finally reading the documents instead of simply accepting their version of the truth. I watched my father sitting confidently at the plaintiff's table while Judge Hayes continued examining the documents. And for the first time in years, I stopped wondering whether I had somehow deserved everything that had happened. Instead, I found myself remembering dozens of moments that had never made sense until now. At the time, they seemed like isolated misunderstandings, the kind of unfortunate events every family experiences once in a while. Looking back, they formed a pattern that stretched across nearly 2 decades. It began shortly after I graduated from college. My first full-time job paid enough for me to rent a small apartment on the edge of the city, and although it was nothing fancy, I was proud of every piece of furniture inside because I had purchased it with money I had earned myself. One Saturday afternoon, my parents drove over unexpectedly, carrying homemade cookies and smiling as though they simply wanted to visit. My mother walked slowly through the apartment, complimenting the clean kitchen and neatly organized bookshelves. My father nodded approvingly before asking whether I had considered letting him help me manage my finances. "You work hard," he said, "but experience matters more than effort. I know how to protect money. You should trust your family." At the time, it sounded reasonable. I had spent my entire life believing that parents always knew best. He suggested that I give him temporary access to several financial records so he could help me create a better long-term plan. He explained that successful families work together instead of separately. I thanked him and agreed without giving it much thought. Nothing unusual happened immediately, so I never questioned the conversation again. A few months later, I applied for a professional certification that required copies of several financial documents and tax records. I spent an entire weekend searching through file cabinets, desk drawers, and storage boxes because important paperwork had somehow disappeared. My father insisted that I must have misplaced everything during my move. "You have always been absent-minded," he reminded me with a disappointed smile. I believed him because that explanation fit the version of myself I had accepted for years. Eventually, I ordered replacement documents, paid additional processing fees, and moved on with my life. Then there was the promotion I almost lost. My supervisor called me into his office one Monday morning and asked why I had ignored several important emails regarding a management training program. I stared at him in complete confusion because I had never received those messages. He kindly printed copies showing they had been sent weeks earlier. Somehow, every one of them had been forwarded to an older email address that I had stopped using years before. I apologized repeatedly even though I could not explain what had happened. Fortunately, he believed it had been an honest mistake and gave me another opportunity. When I mentioned the situation during Sunday dinner, my father shook his head. "Details matter, Ethan. Successful people pay attention." My mother reached across the table and gently patted my hand. "We only worry because you make life so difficult for yourself." Again, I accepted their explanation instead of trusting my own instincts. There were countless moments like that. Birthday cards that supposedly never arrived. Invitations I learned about after family gatherings had already ended. Conversations everyone else claimed they had told me about even though I had no memory of hearing them. Whenever I expressed confusion, someone would smile sympathetically and suggest that I was forgetful or distracted. After enough years, you stop questioning everyone else and start questioning yourself. The strangest incident happened 3 years before the lawsuit. My company announced an employee stock purchase program that offered generous matching contributions. I signed every required document and scheduled automatic payroll deductions. 6 months later, the Human Resources Department contacted me because none of my paperwork had been completed. They showed me signed forms that should have contained my signature. I distinctly remembered filling them out, yet there they were, completely blank except for my printed name. I felt embarrassed and frustrated. I blamed myself once again. My father laughed when I told him about it over the phone. "You have always rushed through important things," he said. "Maybe one day you will learn." It never crossed my mind that someone else might have benefited from convincing me that every unexplained problem was simply another example of my own incompetence. The final piece that refused to fit came shortly after my grandmother passed away. She had always treated me with quiet kindness, never comparing me with Daniel or measuring my worth against impossible standards. A few weeks after her funeral, I asked my mother whether Grandma had left behind the old pocket watch she used to promise me when I was a little boy. My mother looked genuinely surprised before saying, "She changed her mind years ago. She said you would probably lose it." The answer stung, but I accepted it because disappointment had become familiar. Nearly a year later, I ran into my grandmother's longtime neighbor at a grocery store. During our conversation, she smiled warmly and asked whether I still carried the pocket watch my grandmother loved so much. When I looked confused, she frowned. "She talked about giving it to you all the time," she said. "She wanted you to remember that someone always believed in you." I stood frozen beside the shopping carts long after she walked away. That conversation stayed with me for months because it was the first time someone else's memory directly contradicted the story my parents had given me. Even then, I resisted drawing conclusions. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Families misunderstand each other. Memories fade. People make mistakes. I wanted those explanations to be true because accepting anything else meant questioning the people who had shaped my entire understanding of myself. Now, sitting only a few feet away from them in that courtroom, I could no longer ignore the uncomfortable feeling growing inside me. Judge Hayes was not studying random paperwork. She was carefully assembling a timeline. Every page she turned seemed connected to another moment I had dismissed years earlier. Every note she made suggested that the scattered pieces of my life might belong to a much larger picture. For the first time, I wondered whether I had never truly been the careless son my parents described. Perhaps I had simply spent my entire life believing a story that someone else had written for me. I never imagined that my parents would take me to court. If someone had suggested that possibility even a year earlier, I would have laughed and said they were being dramatic. Families argued. Families misunderstood one another. Families sometimes stopped speaking for a while. But families did not file lawsuits against their own children simply because they felt disappointed. At least that was what I believed until the certified envelope arrived at my front door on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had just returned home after another ordinary day at work when I noticed the thick envelope resting beside the welcome mat. The return address belonged to a law office downtown. At first, I assumed it had been delivered to the wrong house. I looked at the label again. My full name was printed neatly across the front. I carried it inside, set it on the kitchen counter, and stared at it for nearly 5 minutes before opening it. The words inside felt almost unreal. My parents were accusing me of financial misconduct, claiming that I had convinced them to make investments that caused significant losses and that I had failed to honor personal financial commitments made to them over several years. According to the complaint, they had repeatedly tried to resolve the matter privately, but I had refused to cooperate. I read every page twice before setting the documents down. None of it matched reality. I had never managed their investments. I had never borrowed the amounts they described. I had never signed the agreements referenced in the filing. Yet the complaint was written with such confidence that even I briefly questioned whether I had forgotten something important. That old habit of doubting myself returned almost instantly. I called my mother first. She answered after only 2 rings. Her voice sounded calm, almost cheerful. I asked whether there had been some terrible misunderstanding. There was a long silence before she quietly said, "You should have listened to your father years ago." Then she ended the call. I tried calling my father immediately afterward. He did not answer. Instead, an hour later, I received a short text message that read, "Our attorney will communicate with you from this point forward." I stared at those words for a long time. They felt colder than anything either of my parents had ever said to me. The next morning, I contacted an attorney recommended by one of my coworkers. That was how I met Michael Carter. His office overlooked a busy intersection filled with coffee shops and office buildings, yet the room itself felt remarkably quiet. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything I could remember. I expected him to tell me the situation looked hopeless. Instead, he asked a single question that caught me completely off guard. Do you have copies of your financial records going back at least 10 years? I admitted that I had most of them, although several important documents had mysteriously disappeared over the years. He nodded thoughtfully instead of looking surprised. Then he asked another question. Have there been other situations where paperwork seemed to vanish or important information never reached you? I hesitated before, slowly describing the missing tax records, the certification documents, the stock purchase forms, and several other incidents that had always seemed unrelated. Michael listened carefully without dismissing any of them. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Sometimes, he said quietly, people spend years treating isolated events as coincidence because accepting any other explanation feels impossible. That sentence stayed with me. Over the next several weeks, we gathered everything we could find. Employment records, bank statements, tax returns, emails, property records, calendar entries, receipts that I had nearly thrown away years earlier. The more information we collected, the stranger everything became. Dates did not line up. Transactions referenced in the lawsuit appeared inconsistent with official banking records. Several documents mentioned signatures that looked similar to mine, but somehow felt slightly different every time I examined them. Michael never rushed to conclusions. Instead, he built a timeline on a large whiteboard covering nearly an entire wall of his office. Every meeting added another piece. Every new document answered one question while creating two more. Meanwhile, my parents appeared completely confident. Through their attorney, they rejected every attempt to settle the dispute. They insisted that the evidence overwhelmingly supported their claims. Friends from church quietly stopped calling. A few relatives became noticeably distant. My cousin politely canceled our annual family barbecue without offering much explanation. News travels quickly through extended families, especially when only one side tells the story first. I understood exactly what my parents were doing because I had watched them shape narratives my entire life. They never shouted. They never made outrageous accusations. They simply repeated the same version of events often enough that people accepted it as truth. Once a reputation becomes established, facts struggle to catch up. The weeks before the hearing became emotionally exhausting. I continued going to work every morning, attending meetings, and completing projects as though life remained perfectly normal. At night, I returned home to stacks of legal documents spread across my dining room table. Sometimes I found myself staring at the paperwork without reading a single word because one question kept repeating inside my mind. Why? If money had truly been the goal, there had been easier ways to ask for it. If revenge had been the goal, I could not understand what I had supposedly done to deserve it. The lawsuit felt less like a disagreement and more like the final chapter of a story that had begun long before I realized I was part of it. Then, 3 days before the hearing, Michael received an unexpected phone call. I could tell from his expression that something important had happened. After ending the conversation, he remained silent for several seconds before looking directly at me. Someone has come forward, he said carefully. This person claims to have information that neither side has presented. I asked who it was, but he slowly shook his head. I cannot say yet because I need to verify everything first. What I can tell you is that if these records are authentic, they could change the entire direction of this case. At that moment, I assumed he was simply talking about another financial document. I had no idea that the folder now resting on Judge Hayes's bench contained evidence capable of rewriting nearly every painful memory I had carried since childhood. I could feel the atmosphere in the courtroom shifting long before anyone else seemed to notice it. Judge Eleanor Hayes continued reading through the folder that had unexpectedly appeared on her bench, carefully turning each page without showing the slightest hint of emotion. My parents remained confident. My father occasionally whispered to his attorney, while my mother sat with her hands folded neatly together, wearing the same calm expression she had perfected over decades. To everyone watching, they looked like respectable parents who had finally reached the end of their patience with an irresponsible son. I almost envied how convincing they appeared. Judge Hayes finally looked up. Instead of addressing either attorney, she focused on the court clerk. Please confirm when this supplemental evidence was received. The clerk quickly reviewed a document before answering. 3 business days ago, Your Honor, accompanied by sworn affidavits and certified financial records. I noticed Michael Carter remained completely still beside me. He had known something important was coming, but even he seemed uncertain about exactly what the folder contained. Across the room, my father's attorney stood confidently. Your Honor, if these materials have not yet been properly introduced, we request that the court continue with the original testimony. Judge Hayes calmly shook her head. The court has already reviewed the submissions sufficiently to determine that it may directly affect the credibility of several claims presented in this matter. Those words changed everything. For the first time that morning, I saw my father's confident posture stiffen ever so slightly. It lasted only a moment before he straightened his shoulders again, but the change was unmistakable. Judge Hayes opened another document. Mr. Brooks, she said, looking directly at my father. You stated under oath that your son assumed responsibility for managing certain financial transactions beginning approximately 11 years ago. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, my father answered without hesitation. He insisted on helping us. And you maintain that every transaction described in your complaint was authorized by him? Absolutely. Judge Hayes nodded once before glancing back at the papers. Interesting. She spoke the words so quietly that several people leaned forward in their seats. There was nothing dramatic about her tone. It was simply thoughtful, almost analytical. She turned another page before continuing. The court has received records indicating that several of the accounts referenced in your complaint required dual authorization during the period in question. Can you explain why multiple authorization logs identify only one recurring user? The courtroom became noticeably quieter. My father blinked once before answering. I am not familiar with technical banking procedures. Perhaps not, Judge Hayes replied calmly. But according to these records, every change made to those accounts originated from devices registered exclusively to your residence. My father's attorney immediately stood. Objection, Your Honor. We have not yet examined the authenticity of those records. You will have every opportunity, Judge Hayes answered. At this moment, I am simply asking whether your client disputes the addresses associated with these access logs. No one answered immediately. My mother shifted slightly in her chair, her composed smile fading just enough for me to notice. It was the first genuine expression I had seen from her all day. Michael leaned slightly toward me without taking his eyes off the judge. Do not react, he whispered almost silently. Just listen. My heart pounded harder than it had at any point since entering the courthouse. The judge was asking questions that none of us had anticipated. She was not discussing emotional accusations or family disagreements. She was following records, dates, and verified documentation. Facts had begun replacing opinions. Judge Hayes carefully lifted another page from the folder. The supplemental submission also contains correspondence provided voluntarily by an independent third party. She paused briefly before continuing. This individual states that concerns regarding unusual financial documentation were raised several years ago, but were never formally investigated because the matter appeared to involve private family affairs. A quiet murmur spread through the gallery before the bailiff reminded everyone to remain silent. My mind raced. I tried to imagine who this mysterious person could possibly be. A former accountant, a bank employee, someone connected to my grandmother's estate. Every possibility seemed equally unlikely. Michael had told me only that someone had come forward at the last minute. He had never revealed their identity because he wanted to verify every document first. Apparently, he had succeeded. Judge Hayes continued reviewing the file with extraordinary patience. She highlighted several dates, compared them against the original complaint, then organized separate exhibits into neat stacks. She was building something piece by piece, and every additional question seemed designed to test whether the original story could survive careful examination. My father's attorney requested a brief recess, arguing that the newly submitted material required additional preparation. Judge Hayes considered the request before denying it. The evidence was disclosed in accordance with procedural requirements, she explained. Furthermore, the court believes clarification should begin immediately because several statements already entered into the record may depend upon these materials. My father slowly adjusted his tie. It was a tiny gesture, but I recognized it from childhood. Whenever he felt pressured during important business meetings, he always reached for his tie before speaking. Until that moment, I had never realized how predictable certain habits could become over time. Judge Hayes closed one section of the folder and opened another. Before this hearing continues, she said, the court intends to establish a complete timeline beginning with the earliest documented financial activity. She looked first toward my parents and then toward me. Once that timeline is complete, many of the remaining questions may answer themselves. I felt an unfamiliar emotion begin replacing years of uncertainty. It was not relief because nothing had been decided yet. It was not satisfaction because my family was still sitting only a few feet away. It was something far quieter. For the first time in my life, someone with no personal history, no emotional investment, and no reason to favor either side was examining the facts instead of accepting the story. Whatever happened next would no longer depend on who sounded more convincing. It would depend on evidence, and as Judge Hayes carefully organized the growing stack of documents before her, I had the unmistakable feeling that the version of my life I had believed for decades was about to be challenged in ways none of us had expected. I had spent years believing that the truth would arrive all at once, like a single dramatic moment that erased every lie in an instant. Instead, it arrived one document at a time. Judge Eleanor Hayes picked up the first exhibit from the supplemental file and placed it beside the original financial records submitted with my parents' complaint. She studied both versions carefully before speaking. The court has identified several inconsistencies that require clarification. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational, but every word seemed to echo across the silent courtroom. Mr. Brooks, according to your sworn statement, your son assumed responsibility for managing these investment accounts in March of 2013. My father nodded confidently. That is correct, Your Honor. Judge Hayes lifted another page. However, certified access records from the financial institution indicate that no credentials associated with your son were ever granted authorization during that period. Instead, every administrative change originated from a single user profile registered under your own name. My father's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, there may be technical explanations for those records. There may be, Judge Hayes replied evenly, which is precisely why I am asking for one. The courtroom waited. My father cleared his throat before answering. I handled certain technical matters because my son was unfamiliar with the system. Judge Hayes made a brief note before asking another question. If your son lacked access to the accounts, how was he able to complete the unauthorized transactions described in your complaint? No one spoke. It was a simple question, yet it seemed to remove all the confidence from the room. My father looked toward his attorney for several seconds before saying, he instructed us verbally. Judge Hayes nodded again without revealing any reaction. Interesting. That differs from your written affidavit, which states that all investment decisions were executed directly by your son through electronic account access. She placed both documents side by side where everyone could see them. Even from where I was sitting, the contradiction was obvious. Michael Carter quietly slid a yellow legal pad toward me with only 4 handwritten words across the top. Let her keep talking. I understood exactly what he meant. We did not need dramatic speeches. The evidence was beginning to speak for itself. Judge Hayes turned to another exhibit. The court also received authentication reports regarding several signatures submitted with the original complaint. She paused while reviewing the analysis. According to the independent examiner, multiple signatures attributed to Mr. Ethan Brooks display measurable differences in writing pressure, letter spacing, and stroke sequence when compared with verified employment and tax records from the same period. My heartbeat became louder inside my own ears. I remembered staring at copies of those signatures in Michael's office, feeling that something looked wrong even though I could not explain why. Now an independent expert had reached the same conclusion. My father's attorney objected again, requesting additional time to evaluate the handwriting analysis, but Judge Hayes calmly reminded him that the report had been disclosed before the hearing according to court procedures. Then she opened the final section of the folder. There is another matter the court considers highly relevant. She lifted a sealed envelope that had already been marked as an exhibit. This correspondence was voluntarily submitted by the former senior compliance manager employed by the financial institution involved in this case. A quiet murmur spread through the gallery before disappearing almost immediately. Judge Hayes continued. The witness states that approximately 4 years ago, an internal review identified repeated requests to modify account documentation without adding an additional authorized account holder despite paperwork suggesting that another individual exercised financial control. She looked directly toward my father. Do you recall those discussions? My father's face remained composed, but the confidence that had filled the courtroom earlier that morning was gone. I do not remember every conversation from years ago, he answered carefully. That is understandable, Judge Hayes replied. Fortunately, written records tend to remember quite well. She held up another document. Meeting notes prepared by the compliance manager indicate that your institution declined multiple requests because supporting authorization from your son could not be verified. My mind immediately returned to all the missing paperwork, the vanished forms, the unexplained delays, and every conversation in which I had been told that I was careless or forgetful. One by one, those memories began settling into a completely different picture. It was never about isolated mistakes. It was about maintaining the appearance that I controlled decisions I had never been allowed to make. Judge Hayes continued building the timeline with remarkable precision. She compared account access logs with travel records, employment schedules, and electronic timestamps. Several transactions listed in the complaint supposedly occurred while I was attending mandatory training hundreds of miles away, something confirmed by company attendance records and hotel receipts that Michael had gathered weeks earlier. The sequence simply did not fit. Every new comparison weakened the foundation of the original accusations. Then came the moment that changed everything for me personally. Judge Hayes reached for a small inventory document from my late grandmother's estate. One additional item appears unrelated at first glance, she said, but it demonstrates a recurring pattern concerning the handling of family property and documentation. She explained that an estate inventory listed a vintage pocket watch specifically designated for me, accompanied by handwritten instructions preserved with the probate records. My chest tightened. I had been told my grandmother changed her mind. I had accepted that explanation for nearly a year. Yet the official inventory clearly recorded something entirely different. It was a small object with very little financial value, but it represented something much greater. It proved that at least one painful memory I had blamed on my own shortcomings had never been true at all. Judge Hayes carefully placed the inventory beside the financial exhibits. The court is not making final findings at this stage, she said. However, the consistency of these documentary conflicts requires careful examination before any conclusion can be reached. I looked across the courtroom toward my parents. For years I had searched there, faces hoping to find approval. Now I searched for something else entirely. I wanted to understand why maintaining a false story had mattered more than allowing their own son to live an honest life. They avoided looking at me. For the first time I realized that the silence between us was no longer filled with doubt. It was filled with evidence, and evidence had a way of revealing truths that emotions could hide for years. I realized that the courtroom had become quieter than at any other point during the hearing. Earlier that morning the silence had belonged to confidence. Now it belonged to uncertainty. Judge Eleanor Hayes had not raised her voice once, yet every carefully documented fact had chipped away at the story my parents had spent years constructing. My father's attorney requested permission to conduct additional questioning, hoping to restore control of the hearing. Judge Hayes agreed with a simple nod. Proceed. The attorney walked toward the witness stand with measured confidence, but even he seemed more cautious than before. Mr. Richard Brooks, he began, would you please explain to the court why your son would have been involved in discussions about these financial accounts if he had no responsibility for them? My father straightened his jacket before answering. Because he wanted to learn how investments worked. I was teaching him. It sounded reasonable until Judge Hayes quietly looked down at the timeline she had assembled. Earlier today, she said, you testified that your son insisted on managing these accounts himself. Now you are stating that he was merely learning from you. Which statement should the court rely upon? My father hesitated. It was only a few seconds, but after a lifetime of hearing him answer every question immediately, those few seconds felt enormous. Both statements are true in different ways, he finally replied. Judge Hayes wrote another note without comment. Michael Carter remained completely still beside me. He had told me from the beginning that contradictions often revealed more than arguments. One inconsistent answer rarely changed a case by itself, but several conflicting explanations presented under oath gradually became impossible to ignore. My father's attorney shifted the conversation toward my work history, attempting to suggest that I had struggled financially during the years in question. Michael immediately responded by presenting certified payroll records showing steady promotions, consistent salary increases, and annual performance bonuses. Every document matched official tax filings already entered into evidence. Judge Hayes compared the dates carefully before placing those records beside the financial timeline. These employment records indicate continuous, full-time work throughout the relevant period, she observed. The court notes no indication of financial instability requiring assistance from the plaintiffs. My father quietly folded his hands together. I noticed my mother watching him instead of the judge, almost as though she was waiting for him to decide what should happen next. It reminded me of countless family dinners when she had allowed him to answer every important question before offering her own opinion. For years I had interpreted that as respect. Sitting in the courtroom, I began wondering whether it had always been something else. The attorney representing my parents then called my mother to testify. Susan Brooks approached the witness stand with the same calm expression that had convinced so many people throughout my life. She spoke softly, choosing every word with care. "We only wanted to help our son," she said. "Everything we ever did was for his future." Hearing those words would once have filled me with guilt. Instead, I found myself listening for details. Judge Hayes did the same. "Mrs. Brooks," she asked gently, "you stated earlier that your son frequently misplaced important documents." "Yes, Your Honor." "Can you provide specific examples?" My mother smiled politely. "There were many over the years." "Please describe one." Another pause followed. "Well, there were tax papers." Judge Hayes glanced toward the evidence table. "The tax records submitted to this court were ultimately obtained directly from government archives because the originals could not be located. Do you know what became of those original files?" "No." "Were they stored in your residence before your son moved into his own apartment?" "I believe so." "Who had access to those files at that time?" My mother looked briefly toward my father before answering. "Mostly Richard and I." Judge Hayes thanked her and quietly recorded another note. No dramatic confrontation took place. No one accused anyone of lying. Instead, every answer seemed to narrow the possibilities until only one explanation remained consistent with the documents. Then Michael requested permission to introduce one final exhibit connected to the supplemental evidence. It was a collection of archived electronic correspondence recovered from secure backups maintained by the financial institution. Judge Hayes reviewed several pages before reading a short portion aloud. One message from years earlier referenced repeated requests for additional authorization forms because the listed account holder had never personally appeared to verify changes. Another internal email recommended suspending further modifications until proper verification could be completed. Those recommendations had apparently never been followed because the requests were later withdrawn. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Hayes placed the emails beside the banking records. My father's attorney attempted to explain that administrative misunderstandings occurred regularly within large financial institutions. Judge Hayes agreed that they certainly could. Then she calmly observed that misunderstandings rarely aligned so precisely with contradictory testimony, missing documentation, inconsistent signatures, and verified account access records. One issue might be coincidence. Two issues might be unfortunate. But when every inconsistency pointed in the same direction, coincidence became increasingly difficult to accept. I looked around the courtroom and noticed subtle changes in the faces of people seated behind us. Earlier they had watched me with quiet skepticism. Now many were studying the evidence instead of the people involved. That simple shift meant more than I could describe. For most of my life, I had lived under the weight of assumptions. Now the assumptions were disappearing, replaced by facts anyone could examine. Judge Hayes finally folded her hands together. "The court has no interest in assigning blame prematurely," she said. "Its responsibility is to determine what the evidence supports." She looked directly at both attorneys. "At this stage, the documentary record substantially differs from the narrative presented in the original complaint. Accordingly, the court will continue evaluating the remaining evidence with particular attention to credibility." Credibility. The word lingered in the room long after she finished speaking. My parents had built their case on the belief that everyone would automatically trust them. For decades, that approach had worked inside our family because no one questioned the story. Here, however, every statement required proof. Every claim had to survive comparison against records created long before the lawsuit existed. As the hearing moved toward its final phase, I realized that something much larger than my reputation was changing. The version of my life that had shaped every decision I made since childhood was quietly falling apart, not because someone defended me with passionate speeches, but because ordinary documents, preserved for years by people with no personal stake in our family, refused to support the story I had been taught to believe. Judge Eleanor Hayes removed her glasses for the first time that afternoon and rested them carefully on the bench before looking across the courtroom. It was a small gesture, but everyone immediately understood that something important was about to happen. She spent several quiet moments reviewing the final pages of the evidence file before speaking with the same steady voice that had guided the hearing from the beginning. The court has now reviewed the testimony, the financial documentation, the authenticated account records, the handwriting analysis, the employment history, the probate inventory, and the supplemental materials submitted by an independent third party. She paused just long enough for every person in the room to understand the weight of those words. This matter has become significantly different from the case originally presented. My father lowered his eyes toward the table. It was the first time all day that he seemed unable to meet the judge's gaze. My mother remained motionless beside him, her hands still folded together, but the familiar confidence had disappeared from her expression. For years I had imagined what it might feel like if someone finally believed me. Strangely, it did not feel triumphant. It felt quiet, almost unreal, as though I were watching someone else's life unfold from a distance. Judge Hayes continued. The plaintiffs based their claims upon the assertion that the defendant exercised independent authority over financial decisions that resulted in measurable losses. However, the documentary record does not support that assertion. She carefully referenced the timeline that had been assembled throughout the hearing. Every important date aligned with verified records instead of personal recollections. Every disputed transaction had been examined alongside independent documentation. Every unanswered question had gradually narrowed until only one consistent sequence remained. Michael Carter stood only when the judge invited brief, closing remarks from both attorneys. He did not attempt to dramatize the moment. He simply thanked the court for its careful review and reminded everyone that objective records often reveal details that memory alone cannot preserve. His words lasted only a few minutes, yet they reflected everything he had told me since the day we first met. Truth did not become stronger because someone spoke louder. It became stronger because it remained consistent. My father's attorney approached the podium afterward. His confident tone from earlier had softened noticeably. Rather than repeating the original accusations, he emphasized misunderstandings, communication failures, and the emotional strain that complicated long family relationships. As I listened, I realized that the story itself had changed. Only hours earlier they had insisted I was entirely responsible. Now they were asking the court to believe that everyone had simply become confused. Judge Hayes thanked both attorneys before returning to the evidence one final time. This court recognizes that family disputes often involve deeply personal emotions, she said. However, judicial decisions must rest upon verifiable facts rather than assumptions developed over time. She looked directly toward me before continuing. The documentary evidence demonstrates that multiple central allegations presented in the complaint are unsupported by authenticated financial records, account authorization logs, and independent verification. Then she turned toward my parents. Furthermore, several statements presented under oath have proven inconsistent with contemporaneous documentation. The silence that followed seemed to last forever. No one moved. Even the spectators remained completely still. Judge Hayes finally announced that the complaint against me could not be sustained based upon the evidence before the court. She explained that the objective record overwhelmingly contradicted the factual foundation necessary to support the claims that had been brought against me. She also noted that the documented inconsistencies identified during the hearing raised serious concerns regarding the reliability of the narrative originally presented. Those words settled over the courtroom with extraordinary calm. There was no applause, no dramatic reaction. Justice rarely sounded the way movies suggested it should. Sometimes it sounded like a careful explanation delivered by someone committed to following the facts wherever they led. I slowly released a breath that I did not realize I had been holding. Months of anxiety seemed to leave my body all at once. Michael quietly placed a hand on my shoulder and smiled for the first time since the hearing began. "You did exactly what you needed to do," he whispered. "You let the evidence speak." Across the room, my father remained seated, staring at the table in front of him. My mother finally looked toward me, but the expression on her face was unfamiliar. It was not anger. It was not disappointment. It was something closer to uncertainty, as though she no longer recognized the story she had repeated for so many years. For a brief moment, our eyes met. I expected to feel resentment after everything that had happened, yet I mostly felt sadness. Not because the court had reached the wrong decision, but because no legal ruling could return the years I had spent believing I deserved every criticism, every comparison, and every accusation. Judge Hayes gathered her papers before offering one final observation. The court encourages every family to remember that assumptions repeated often enough can eventually resemble truth. That resemblance does not change the underlying facts. She wished everyone well before formally concluding the hearing. People slowly began leaving their seats. Conversations started quietly throughout the courtroom as spectators filtered toward the hallway. Several individuals who had avoided looking at me earlier now offered respectful nods while passing by. No words were necessary. Their expressions alone told me that the story they believed when they entered the courtroom was no longer the story they carried with them as they left. I remained seated for another minute, looking at the empty witness stand where so many painful memories had finally been measured against something stronger than opinion. The evidence had not erased my past, but it had restored something I thought was gone forever. It had returned the simple certainty that I had not imagined the confusion, the missing pieces, or the endless self-doubt. For the first time since I was a little boy standing in my parents' living room hoping to earn their approval, I understood that my value had never depended upon whether they chose to recognize it. 1 year later, I found myself standing beside the window of my office watching the first snowfall settle across the parking lot, and it struck me how ordinary life had become. There were no more court dates marked on my calendar, no more late-night meetings with attorneys, and no more stacks of legal documents covering my dining room table. My mornings began with coffee, quiet drives to work, and conversations with co-workers who knew me for the person I truly was instead of the story someone else had written about me. The lawsuit had ended months earlier, but the greatest change was not found inside the courthouse records. It happened inside my own mind. For the first time in my life, I stopped measuring my worth by the approval of people who had never intended to give it. That realization did not happen overnight. During the weeks following the hearing, I often caught myself expecting another phone call filled with criticism or another message reminding me that I had somehow disappointed everyone. The calls never came. My parents remained silent. At first, that silence felt uncomfortable because I had spent decades trying to earn conversations that usually ended with another comparison or another reminder that I was falling short. Gradually, the silence became peaceful. It gave me room to hear my own thoughts without someone else's voice constantly defining who I was supposed to be. Michael Carter invited me to lunch several weeks after the case officially concluded. We met at a small diner a few blocks from his office, the kind of place where regular customers knew the waitresses by name and everyone seemed in no hurry to leave. After we finished eating, he smiled and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Now that you no longer have to prove anything in court, what do you want your life to look like?" I realized I had never seriously considered that question before. For years, every decision I made had been shaped by the hope that my parents might finally approve of me. Once that hope disappeared, an entirely different future became possible. I accepted a leadership position at work that I had previously declined because I feared additional responsibility would take time away from family obligations. My company trusted me with larger projects, and for the first time I accepted praise without immediately searching for reasons why I did not deserve it. My coworkers noticed the change long before I did. One afternoon my supervisor told me, "You seem lighter these days." He was right. Carrying someone else's expectations for decades is exhausting. Setting them down feels almost strange at first because you forget what freedom weighs. A few months later, I visited my grandmother's grave carrying a small velvet box in my coat pocket. After the hearing concluded, The probate attorney contacted me to explain that the pocket watch listed in the estate inventory had finally been located among several stored family belongings. When I opened the box for the first time, I found a folded note tucked beneath the watch. The handwriting belonged to my grandmother. She had written only one sentence: "Never let someone else's opinion become the measure of your heart." I sat on the bench beside her headstone for a long time, reading those words again and again. She had understood something about me that I had spent years trying to discover for myself. The watch now rests on the bookshelf in my living room, where I see it every morning before leaving for work. It reminds me that one honest voice can matter more than years of unfair criticism. As for my parents, we never returned to the relationship we once had, although I eventually stopped carrying anger toward them. Forgiveness, I learned, is not the same as pretending nothing happened. It is choosing not to allow yesterday's pain to decide tomorrow's direction. I no longer waited for apologies that might never come. I no longer replayed old conversations hoping to rewrite them. I simply accepted that some people are unable to offer the love we spend our lives hoping to receive. Accepting that truth allowed me to stop chasing it. Occasionally, someone who heard about the case asks whether winning in court felt satisfying. I always give the same answer. The courtroom did not give me victory. It gave me clarity. The legal decision restored my reputation, but it also revealed something much more valuable. It showed me that facts remain true even when they are ignored, and that character is not determined by whoever speaks the loudest. Looking back now, I no longer define my childhood by the comparisons or the endless reminders that I was never enough. I remember the teachers who encouraged me, the coworkers who believed in me, my grandmother who quietly saw my value long before I could see it myself, and a judge who chose to examine evidence instead of assumptions. Those people helped me understand that truth has a remarkable kind of patience. It does not rush. It does not demand attention. It simply waits until someone is willing to look carefully enough to recognize it. If there is one lesson my journey left behind, it is this. Sometimes the hardest prison to escape is not built from walls. It is built from words repeated so often that they begin to sound like your own thoughts. The day you finally question those words is the day the door quietly opens. I walked out of the courthouse believing I had left a lawsuit behind. Only much later did I realize I had also left behind the frightened little boy who spent his entire life trying to earn love by becoming someone else. From that day forward, I chose something different. I chose to become the person I had always been, whether anyone else approved or not. And that decision gave me something no courtroom, no verdict, and no judgment could ever take away again. It gave me peace.